M2 case study, historicizing the South African food system. Contrary to the general view of Africa's food systems, that these were predominantly rural, and when viewed only from a production perspective, this might well be the case. However, when viewed from a wider food systems perspective, other positions may also be true. One view is that when you take a historical view of the food system, one realizes that the design and earlier foundational decisions about how an optimal functioning food system might perform and who it might best serve, a different view emerges. For many countries with an extractive, mineral, industrial, colonial legacy, one built on maximum resource extraction, one where the economic system and the creation of wealth for the colonial elites was the primary concern, one can start to see a food system that in fact has always been about serving an urban population and intersecting with the urban food system. While the South African case is not unique, it has contextual markers that might be different to other countries. To reflect on the historical foundations of South African, as well as many other colonial countries with significant mineral deposits that the colonial powers sought to exploit, the current food system and the wider political economy has its origins in the discoveries of these minerals. So if you'll indulge me, I'll take you on a brief and very high-level tour of the South African history to show how this has impacted how the food system, and particularly the urban food system in South Africa, functions. In Southern Africa, in the mid-1800s, there was a productive and skilled black farmer class, farmers producing food across the region. Practices and modes of farming were contextual, responding to and embedded within regional ecologies, soil types, weather systems, traditions, all feeding into regional food sheds. These farmers were providing food to the growing urban centers. The food production systems were diverse, well adapted to local conditions, droughts, extreme weather events that had always been a component of this in the Southern African region. But these risks were mitigated through a diversity of crops planted, such as local millets. This also meant that productive areas, communities had no need to engage in emerging colonial economies, unless on their own terms. Two watershed events at the end of the 1800s created significant disruptions in these resilient systems. These two events, first in 1867, the discovery of diamonds in Kimberley, and later in 1884, gold was discovered in what is today the areas around Johannesburg. What these events did was to shift how the economy of these developing countries functioned. In order to work the mines, people arrived in South Africa from all over the world, a gold rush or diamond rush. These processes saw the rapid growth of areas around these mines. As these settlements grew, supporting industrial and processing industries grew as well, resulting in an accelerated industrial development. This growth resulted in the emergence of urban areas. As a result, there was a real need for labor. As the rural areas were productive, there was not necessarily a need to leave the agrarian society and go and see work in these emerging industrial nodes. Forced food system change, racialized dispossession. Here the state intervened and used its power to leverage policy and ideology to support the need for labor, both in the mines and in the aligned industries. First, in 1994, in the Cape Colony of what eventually became South Africa, through what was called the Glen Grey Act, people of colour were denied access to land, anyone who wasn't white. The intention of this was to drive those agrarian societies into the emerging mines and to drive them into lowly paid labour positions. The Union of South Africa took place in 1910, where the various different colonies or territories that combined to create what is today South Africa. Shortly after that, in 1913, the Native Land Act was passed. This act further denied access to land, but now across the newly created South Africa in its entirety. Both of these acts weren't just about land dispossession. They also included other components which sought to impose heavy taxes on black farmers, severely constraining the viability of those farmers who were still able to retain some land. This, of course, drove people from the rural areas into the emerging mining centres. Around these centres, cities started to grow. Most black residents now seeking work in these areas either lived in mining camps or in settlements on the peripheries of these emerging urban areas. The colonial and apartheid legislation meant that people who were not able to integrate into these rapidly growing white cities with a labor force that moved in and out on a daily basis. As growth continued, there was a real political concern. In order for the mining and the industrial elite that had emerged around the mining industry to extract maximum value, they needed to pay the lowest possible wages. But if you are paid low wages and food prices are high, as Bob Marley has said, a hungry man is an angry man, the likelihood of revolt or riot of some form of disruption was high. So key to this was a strategy to provide cheap staple foods to the urban labor force. These staple foods provided satiation, but didn't necessarily provide wellness. What had emerged as a result of the growth of the mining economy and the beginnings of industrialization, from the development of rail networks to expansion of various different industrial processes. These processes saw the creation of new processing plants, new modes of production, support to white farmers. All of these were aligned to South Africa's food system, a system actively designed to bring staples such as maize from other colonies into the urban centers and to feed the urban population with very cheap food. For those working in the hazardous and physically demanding mining sector and the associated environments, the need was for a youthful workforce. As such, concerns over health after bodies grew tired after physical work were not concerns shared by the mining elites. Those unable to work could return to and be cared for in those rural areas. The urban population was a young population, not as young as the population in Africa today, but the health consequences of eating a limited diet made up primarily of staples was of no concern to the urban elites. So what emerged is an unhealthy food system designed to create satiation, but not health and wellness. In the late 1940s, when the National Party came to power, they sought to entrench the spatial and racial systems even further, and one of the key constituencies was the emerging white farmer class. This class attracted significant support being allocated to them in terms of technology, in terms of land, in terms of access to essentials in order to build the productive farming systems such as roads, water access, etc. These processes were further supported by large infrastructure schemes, such as the building of dams, the creation of water schemes, and the buildings of silos. All of these came with legislation that further entrenched a particular food system based on the production of a limited number of key staples. Yes, other foods were being farmed, but most of the food produced that was intended for consumption in South Africa was part of this constrained diet of key staples. These foods were feeding the urban populations, which were now growing rapidly as these cities grew and as industrialization took place in these cities. The infrastructure, the systems, and the support mechanisms, the subsidy mechanisms, all that had been put in place then created the environment which enabled the rapid development of the supermarket sector in South Africa. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, South Africa was an early adopter of the supermarket revolution, and this fundamentally changed how the entire value chain functioned. I argue that while this might be different in other countries, in many colonial countries, this extractive system and the extractive economy was the key focus. The food system in these areas was always about serving and creating a passive urban workforce, a workforce fed on cheap staples, where the intention was never about developing a nation or society. It was never about wellness. It was about ensuring that the economic class was able to extract the most wealth. This was an economic strategy, not a developmentalist strategy, not a food strategy. What this means is that many of the food systems across Africa and other colonial entities in the South have always come with an intergenerational deficit. The South African food system, built from the late 1800s, one whose foundations reach back nearly 150 years, means that for generations, societies, particularly the poor and the marginalized, deeply racialized, have always been subjected to a food system designed to support the economic class, a food system designed to feed cities and city workers, but with an inadequate diet. So violence of historical food system foundations. Rob Nixon, the environmental writer, uses the term slow violence to describe the accretive, hidden violence that is often not seen by society. These histories embody the same slow violence, that same intergenerational constrained access to healthy and nutritious diets that prevent people and societies from being able to thrive. We can't simply seek to shift the needle a little bit. Policy has to be about actively seeking to undo the slow violence, to undo these legacies. This is not about equality. This is about equity. It's about focusing on those that have suffered most from those historical injustices, orientating the urban food systems to support their needs explicitly. This presents a significant governance question. If one considers that for generations the food system has been designed to pacify an urban population, this means that urban governance is increasingly important. How is the food system of a city restructured to enable equity? Some interventions can be done through different forms of design. Some of these processes might require fundamental changes to the economic structures and economic systems. These are radical. This is what Zero Hunger strategy sought to do in Brazil and what the city of Belo Horizonte did, an active and deliberate focus on marginalized communities. Because of these historical legacies, because they embody the slow violence, what needs to be done is quite different to many of the current urban food system responses that fail to actively engage these historical and structural legacies. The reality is that one can't argue that we're working to achieve the universal right to food if that right to food does not embody a measure of historical justice. This places an additional burden on people planning to engage in urban food governance. It asks that we take not just the urban food system view, but how do you build a food system capacities of cities to avoid the slow violence that the converging megatrends might present. This adds additional complexity, but also a different layer of obligation to seek and plan governance approaches in a way that enables a just food system.